August 12th, 1570. The Kremlin stone chambers swallowed sound like a tomb, yet somehow amplified it. In that paradox of architecture and agony, a nobleman's scream ricocheted off vaulted ceilings, while Tsar Ivan IV lounged on his throne, lips curled in something resembling amusement. The smell of incense couldn't mask the copper tang of blood. Noble women in jeweled headdresses forced themselves to watch, their faces carved from marble, as executioners performed their grotesque surgery on a living, conscious man whose crime was alleged conspiracy, a charge as fluid as water in the hands of absolute power. What happened in those chambers wasn't simply execution. It was something far more calculated, more psychologically devastating, something that understood that the human spirit could be shattered not merely through death, but through the complete annihilation of dignity. Here's what history textbooks rarely tell you. Throughout medieval history and beyond, certain monarchs discovered that the most effective terror wasn't swift, it was intimate. They didn't just take lives, they took something more fundamental. And the question that echoes across 5 centuries demands an answer. What happens when unlimited power meets the darkest understanding of human vulnerability? Who will remember these victims when shame itself becomes a weapon of state? The answer lies buried in chronicles written by trembling hands, in archaeological evidence that speaks of iron cages sized for suffering, in the whispered memories of entire populations traumatized into silence. This is the story of rulers who transformed humiliation into an art form, who understood that stripping away dignity could be more devastating than stripping away life itself. The 16th century dawned on a world where power wore a crown and wielded divine authority. From Moscow to Cairo, from Paris to Constantinople, monarchs ruled as earthly representatives of God himself. Not checks, nor balances, only the thin veneer of religious law and the even thinner constraint of noble loyalty stood between a king's whim and its execution. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, ascended to the Russian throne in 1547 at age 16. For the first 13 years, guided by wise advisors and his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, he governed with relative restraint. He reformed legal codes, expanded Russian territory, and showed genuine concern for his subjects. But 1560 became his crucible. Anastasia died suddenly, possibly poisoned, and something in Ivan's mind fractured like ice over dark water. He created the Oprichnina in 1565, not merely a police force, but a parallel state within a state. His black-clad oprichniki rode through Russian territories on black horses, wearing symbols of brooms and dog heads to signify sweeping away treason and snapping at enemies. They answered to no law except Ivan's voice. Heinrich von Staden, a German mercenary who served as an oprichnik from 1564 to 1576, would later write memoirs that historians initially dismissed as exaggeration until archaeological evidence confirmed their horrifying accuracy. Meanwhile, in Cairo during the late 10th century, Caliph al-Hakim bi Amr Allah ruled the Fatimid Caliphate from 996 to 1021 CE. Arab chroniclers like Ibn al-Qalanisi documented his reign with a mixture of bewilderment and terror. Al-Hakim issued decrees that seemed to emanate from a mind at war with reality itself, banning honey, prohibiting the consumption of certain vegetables, and most infamously, forbidding women from leaving their homes entirely. To enforce this edict, he ordered cobblers throughout Cairo to cease manufacturing women's shoes. Without shoes, women couldn't walk the streets. The logic was circular, totalitarian, complete. In 15th century France, Louis XI earned his nickname the Universal Spider through his intricate webs of political intrigue. Ruling from 1461 to 1483, Louis consolidated royal power through marriages, assassinations, and a surveillance network that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. Philippe de Comines, who served as Louis's confidant and chronicler, documented the king's obsession with iron cages, not large prison cells, but coffin-sized contraptions where a man could neither fully stand nor completely recline. The Chateau of Loches still preserves these instruments, their rusted bars testimony to history, facts that no amount of time can erase. 3 rulers, 3 cultures, 3 continents, yet they shared a terrifying insight. Physical death ends suffering. But humiliation, particularly of an intimate nature, creates a suffering that extends far beyond the individual, poisoning families, destroying reputations, and terrorizing populations more effectively than any sword. The prince brought before Ivan's court that August Day in 1570 had committed no provable crime. His offense was suspicion. In Ivan's deteriorating mental landscape, suspicion and guilt merged into the same prosecutable entity. What followed wasn't punishment, it was performance art, staged for maximum psychological impact. Von Staden's account is clinical in its detail. The executioners worked methodically. The court watched not by choice, but by royal command. Failure to watch was itself treasonous. Ivan provided commentary throughout, his voice alternating between mockery and philosophical musing on the nature of loyalty. The prince's family stood among the witnesses. Think about that. His wife, his children. Forced to observe as their patriarch was unmade not just as a man, but as a concept. After the castration, guards marched the bleeding, mutilated nobleman through Moscow's streets. Citizens lined the route again, not by choice. Absence was noted. Names were recorded. The victim was finally executed at Red Square. But by then, death came as mercy. This wasn't anomalous. Russian chronicles document at least 47 similar incidents during Ivan's reign between 1565 and 1584. The January 1570 sack of Novgorod represents the apex of systematic intimate terror. Ivan suspected the city of 30,000 souls of harboring sympathies toward Poland. His solution wasn't mere military conquest. For 5 weeks, the Oprichniki conducted what modern terminology would classify as systematic crimes against humanity, with Ivan himself reportedly observing from an elevated platform in the city square. Contemporary witnesses described the Volkhov River running red, ice breaking from the heat of bodies. Across the Mediterranean, al-Hakim's Cairo became a laboratory for totalitarian control of intimate behavior. When the Caliph banned women's shoes, women caught outside faced public flogging. But al-Hakim's obsessions ran deeper. Medieval history records his belief that controlling reproductive capacity meant controlling society's moral direction. Merchants caught selling forbidden foods, items al-Hakim deemed aphrodisiacs faced public castration in Cairo's main marketplace. Ibn al-Qalanisi documents a specific case from 1013 CE, a man accused of improper gazing at a woman. The punishment exemplified al-Hakim's twisted psychology. First came castration, then came forced cross-dressing. The victim was compelled to wear women's clothing and work in the women's section of the marketplace for the remainder of his life. The punishment combined physical mutilation with gender humiliation, creating a living example that existed in a state of permanent social death. When al-Hakim uncovered a conspiracy among his viziers in 1017, he didn't simply execute them. The conspirators were stripped naked, mounted backward on donkeys, a position of ultimate humiliation in Islamic culture, and paraded through Cairo's streets while citizens threw refuse. Only after this public degradation were they castrated. Only then were they executed. The sequence mattered. Each stage served a specific psychological function in the architecture of terror. Louis XI of France brought European sophistication to the art of humiliation. Cardinal Jean Ballou, who conspired with Charles the Bold of Burgundy against Louis, found himself imprisoned in one of the king's custom-designed iron cages in 1469. The cage measured roughly 4 feet in each dimension, large enough to sit, too small to stand, impossible to lie flat in. Ballou remained caged for 11 years, but Philippe de Comines records that Louis added refinements to mere confinement. Periodically, Ballou was removed from his cage, stripped naked, and displayed in public squares where crowds could mock the fallen cardinal. The psychological warfare was exquisite. A prince of the church, reduced to a curiosity, his body already soft from decades of luxurious living, exhibited like livestock. Louis also pioneered forced marriage as political punishment. When he captured rebel nobles, he identified their most valuable assets, their daughters and widows. These women embodied family honor, carried noble blood, represented alliances and inheritance. Louis forced them into marriages with men of deliberately low status, peasants, merchants, and in at least one documented case from 1477, the royal executioner. The logic was cruel brilliance. The executioner was socially untouchable, handling death made him ritually unclean in medieval European society. Nobles wouldn't eat at his table. Churches seated him separately. His children couldn't play with others. By forcing a duke's daughter to marry this man, Louis didn't just punish the rebel duke, he contaminated the entire bloodline. The marriage was consummated under supervision to ensure its legal validity, adding violation to humiliation. The young woman produced children who carried both noble blood and executioner's taint, living contradictions that served as permanent reminders of the cost of defying royal authority. These weren't isolated incidents of royal rage. They were systematic applications of psychological torture that understood something profound and disturbing about human nature. We can endure almost any physical pain if we maintain our sense of self. But strip away dignity, destroy reputation, humiliate us before our families and communities, that creates wounds that never heal. For centuries, these accounts existed primarily in chronicles that historians often dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Medieval history is full of hyperbole, after all. Enemies painted each other as monsters. Chroniclers served masters who demanded dramatic narratives. Then came the archaeologists. In 1990, during renovations at the Chateau of Loches in France's Loire Valley, workers discovered a sealed chamber beneath the castle. Inside, 3 iron cages, their dimensions matching exactly those described by Philippe de Comines. Each cage bore scratched marks, thousands of them marking days, weeks, years. Chemical analysis of the rust revealed organic compounds, blood, urine, human tissue. The cages weren't propaganda, they were real. Moscow's Novgorod excavations between 2000 and 2015 unearthed mass graves from the winter of 1570. Forensic analysis revealed trauma patterns consistent with the atrocities described in chronicles, evidence of systematic violence before death, skeletal modifications indicating post-mortem mutilation performed for display purposes. Soil samples contained preserved textile fragments, all identical, all black, matching the Oprichniki uniform described by von Staden. In Cairo, 21st century ground-penetrating radar mapped structures beneath Old Cairo that correspond to Ibn al-Khalanisi's descriptions of al-Hakim's expanded market prisons. Islamic architectural historians examining these foundations identified modifications made specifically to facilitate public punishment spectacles, elevated platforms at precise sightlines, drainage systems designed to handle large quantities of liquid, anchoring points for restraints. The physical evidence forces confrontation with uncomfortable history facts. These things happened. Real people with names, families, dreams suffered in these specific, documented ways. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate Ivan IV's reign claimed between 30,000 and 60,000 victims. Al-Hakim's Cairo saw approximately 15,000 people subjected to public punishments between 996 and 1021. Louis XI's iron cages held at least 24 documented prisoners, with chronicles suggesting many more undocumented cases. Behind each number, a story. Take Mikhail Vorotinsky, a Russian prince who served Ivan faithfully in military campaigns against the Tatars. In 1573, suspected of using witchcraft to curse the Tsar, Vorotinsky was brought to Moscow. He was in his 60s. He had won battles for Ivan. None of that mattered. He was tied to a pole, suspended over a slow fire, and roasted alive, while Ivan personally interrogated him about alleged sorcery. Before the fire was lit, he was publicly castrated as punishment for the sexual nature of his supposed magical crimes. His wife, Maria, was forced to watch, then sent to a convent where she lived another 15 years, never speaking of what she witnessed. Or consider Sit al-Mulk, sister of Caliph al-Hakim. Historical sources suggest she orchestrated her brother's disappearance and probable assassination in 1021, possibly because she couldn't endure watching more victims. What psychological toll accumulates when you witness your brother transform into a monster? What breaking point is reached when the cost of silence exceeds the risk of fratricide? The resolution, such as it exists, came through death or disappearance for most of these tyrants. Ivan IV died in 1584, possibly poisoned, his body showing signs of syphilis and mercury poisoning from attempted treatments. His legacy: a traumatized Russia, a nobility decimated, a population that would accept increasingly authoritarian rule for centuries because the alternative chaos seemed worse. Al-Hakim vanished during one of his nocturnal walks outside Cairo in 1021. His body was never found. Most historians believe his sister arranged his assassination. He was 36 years old. Louis XI died in 1483 after years of declining health, paranoid and isolated, having outlived most of his enemies but also most of his friends. His last months were spent in fearful seclusion, convinced of conspiracies around every corner. Their victims fared worse. The intimate nature of these punishments ensured that shame attached not just to individuals, but to entire family lines. Descendants of humiliated nobles carried stains on their reputations for generations. Women forced into degrading marriages produced children who inherited their mother's dishonor. Communities where these spectacles occurred developed collective trauma that shaped social behavior for decades. Act 5. Message: the long shadow of absolute power. 600 miles above Earth, the International Space Station orbits every 90 minutes, carrying humans from multiple nations working together, governed by treaties and shared protocols. In Geneva, the International Criminal Court prosecutes war crimes based on principles of human dignity enshrined in international law. Across democracies worldwide, citizens vote, courts review executive actions, and press exposes corruption. These systems didn't emerge naturally. They were built, painfully, across centuries, by people who understood viscerally what happens when power answers to nothing but itself. The medieval history examined here, Ivan's Oprichnina, al-Hakim's Cairo, Louis's cages represents more than historical curiosity. These cases illuminate a dark truth about human nature. Given absolute authority without accountability, a certain type of personality will exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of human psychology. The body becomes a battlefield. Shame becomes a weapon. Humiliation becomes policy. But here's the philosophical question that echoes across centuries. Why did these specific forms of punishment recur across different cultures, religions, and time periods? Why did rulers separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years independently discover that intimate humiliation terrorizes more effectively than simple execution? The answer reveals something about power itself. Physical death ends an individual's capacity to spread dissent, but public humiliation of an intimate nature creates a contagion of fear. Witnesses internalize the message. Not only can the ruler take your life, but first, he can unmake you as a social being. He can transform you into an object of mockery, can strip away every layer of dignity that makes you human, can force your family to carry shame long after your death. This understanding that attacking human dignity is more devastating than attacking human flesh represents a sophisticated grasp of social psychology. These tyrants were monsters, yes, but they were perceptive monsters. They recognized that humans are fundamentally social creatures who define ourselves through relationships and reputation. Destroy that social self, and you create a death that extends far beyond biological termination. Modern totalitarian regimes understood this lesson. The Nazis' systematic humiliation of Jewish populations before extermination. Stalin's show trials designed not merely to execute, but to break victims psychologically before death. The Khmer Rouge's methods of public degradation. The pattern persists because the psychology persists. Humans can be terrorized most effectively through attacks on dignity. Yet here's the paradox. By studying these extremes, we learn why limitations on power matter absolutely. The horrifying effectiveness of intimate humiliation as political terror explains why modern human rights frameworks obsess over dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, begins not with life but with dignity. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That phrasing isn't accidental. It reflects hard-earned wisdom purchased with centuries of suffering. The transition from societies where monarchs could order castration as entertainment to democracies where even convicted criminals retain human rights didn't occur because humans became morally superior. It occurred because systems evolved that limited what any individual, regardless of their authority, could do to another human being. Separation of powers, independent judiciaries, free press, civil rights protections. These institutions emerged as societal antibodies against the specific pathogens that Ivan, al-Hakim, and Louis represented. The victims of these tyrants deserve more than historical footnotes. They deserve recognition not as nameless statistics, but as individuals whose suffering illuminated a truth. Power without accountability tends toward cruelty, and cruelty without limits gravitates toward the intimate destruction of dignity. Their pain purchased knowledge we cannot afford to forget. In our era, when authoritarian impulses resurface in various nations, when leaders test the boundaries of acceptable behavior, when populations become desensitized to degradation of vulnerable groups in these moments, the stories of medieval history become urgently relevant. They remind us that the gap between civilization and barbarism isn't a chasm requiring catastrophic collapse to cross. It's a membrane, frighteningly thin, maintained only through constant vigilance and institutional strength. The echoes of those screams in the Kremlin's chambers still reverberate. They remind us why no individual should possess absolute authority over another's body or dignity. They explain why human rights aren't luxuries but necessities. They illuminate why democracy, for all its frustrations and inefficiencies, remains humanity's most successful defense against the darkest capabilities of human nature. These history facts aren't comfortable. They don't belong in sanitized textbooks that present the past as a steady march toward progress. They belong in our collective memory, as warnings carved not in stone but in human suffering, warnings about what happens when power meets cruelty, when authority lacks accountability, when the vulnerability of human dignity becomes a weapon of state. The question isn't whether humans are capable of such cruelty. History answers that definitively. The question is whether we'll maintain the systems, institutions, and moral frameworks necessary to prevent its recurrence. Because the capacity for tyranny doesn't vanish with historical progress. It sleeps, waiting for the moment when collective memory fades and vigilance falters. Remember the nobleman in the Kremlin. Remember the merchant in Cairo's marketplace. Remember the cardinal in the iron cage. Remember them not as victims of distant history, but as warnings written in suffering, warnings that remain urgently, terrifyingly relevant today. Their legacy is our responsibility, to ensure that dignity remains inviolable, that power remains constrained, and that the intimate vulnerabilities of human nature never again become instruments of political terror. In the end, that's what these stories teach. The price of freedom is eternal remembrance of what happens without it. And the cost of forgetting? That's measured in screams that echo across centuries, in shame that destroys families, in dignity annihilated by absolute power. We cannot afford to forget. The victims demand better of us. History demands better of us. Our own humanity demands better of us. The theater of absolute terror performed its final act centuries ago, but the script remains, preserved in archaeological evidence, chroniclers' accounts, and the long shadow these tyrants cast across human consciousness. Our task is to ensure it never has a revival.